For this video, we must return to George Pal, who was a major player in 1950s Hollywood science fiction, and we last saw as the producer of Destination Moon, which ushered in post-war space movies. On the back of that mild success, he did two other science fiction films, When Worlds Collide and an adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. This seems to have given both him and his backers at Paramount Pictures the courage to have another go at a hard, ultra-accurate vision of the coming space age. Perhaps assuming the first film's comparative success was due to its realism, and missing the obvious point that a space movie was a novelty in 1950, whereas 5 years on the cinemas were awash with B-movie space films. So, oblivious to the dangers, this new movie was to expand the scope of Destination Moon, and it was grandly called
Conquest of Space.
Greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hempsell, an astronautical systems engineer, and I'm exploring how the cinematic representation of space dominates our cultural perception of the universe that we live in. And Conquest of Space was a movie that was clearly intended to affect the cultural perception of space, and in particular the American cultural perception of space, because nobody doubted back then that the Conquest of Space was going to be an all-American show. And notice the confidence that the journey to Mars would be within the lifetime of the audience. Well, that was 70 years ago, so time is rapidly running out for that particular prophecy. Now, at the time, it might have seemed a fantastical statement. In hindsight, from a technical perspective, it was conservative, even if in the real world it never happened. It highlights the major rule governing human progress into space, known as Martin's Law. Politics first, money second, technicalities last. Thus, the reason that we are not on Mars is politics, even though it has been technically and financially possible for half a century. So what was the pitch that Pal could make to convince the money men at Paramount Pictures to invest in Conquest of Space? Well, first, he had Wernher Von Braun on board as a technical consultant who came with his designs for a mission to Mars. Von Braun had these published in the highly influential Collier magazine, illustrated by the artist Chesley Bonestell, who had also played such a large role in the artistic success of Destination Moon. Von Braun had also appeared in a series of short films by Disney outlining the potential of the coming space age. In short, the American public was getting heavily dosed up on the coming reality of spaceflight, and Von Braun was the face of this publicity hype. So much so that he and Einstein were the reasons all technical or science characters in movies, until well into the 80s, spoke with a German accent.
Of the Earth. The payload in the top section will consist of 10 crew members plus equipment.
Technology required is easily within the means of even the smallest nuclear power. It requires only the will to do so.
I could send you into the future. I could send you to the age of the dinosaurs. Watch.
In addition to Von Braun, George Pal had another exclusive win. He had secured the film rights to the book The Conquest of Space, from which the film would get its title. The author was Willy Ley, a German who had fled to America in the mid-1930s to escape the Nazi regime, with which he'd had some profound disagreements. In his new home, he established a reputation as a writer of science fiction and science fact in magazine articles and books. In 1949, he teamed up with Chesley Bonestell, yes, him again, to produce The Conquest of Space, a little gem of a book, and I happen to be the proud owner of a copy. The book's highlights are the Bonestell paintings, which were as accurate depictions of what it would be like to visit the planets of the solar system as could be expected at the time, and remains to this day a visual feast. It is some of Bonestell's finest astronomical art, and it's hardly surprising the book was a bestseller. So, in 1952, when Pal announced he was going to make a film of the book, it must have seemed as if all the stars had aligned. He had on board the two sauerkraut-chomping Teutons who were the best-known space gurus at the time, and Chesley Bonestell, who had successfully collaborated with both of them, as well as Pal himself on past films. Collier and Disney were to do some heavy lifting publicity-wise, and he had the film rights to a highly successful book. What could possibly go wrong? The film's announcement no doubt brought much cheer to the book's publishers, but it is also good news for the film producers. I know I keep banging on about this, but to have a successful movie, you've got to have great characters who develop in an engaging plot. Now, if you have the rights to a book which has been successful, then you have both plot and characters that have already been road tested with the general public. And so long as you stick to the golden rule of not upsetting the book's fan base by destroying whatever magic made it so beloved, you should be fine. So with that in mind, what do we have in the book The Conquest of Space? Well, we have no hero, no heroine, no murders, no marriages, and nobody gets into a tricky situation over a pound note.
I may be as thick as a whale omelette, but even I know a book's got to have a plot.
Not this one, sir.
You have to wonder if Mr. Pal or indeed any of the film's production team had actually read the book that they'd just bought the rights to. If they had, they would have spotted two major shortfalls in this source material. The book is a popular astronomy education work, and it is entirely factual. So the first problem is there is a complete absence of any filmable story, fictional or otherwise. So the screenplay is going to have to be written from scratch without any prior public testing. The film has 4 identified screenplay writers. Now you might imagine these 4 guys are in a room together, bouncing ideas, rejecting the weak stuff, and generally making the whole greater than the sum of the parts. But no. The script was passed round one after the other like a hand grenade with the pin out, leaving a complete mess of a melodrama.
We went to a lot of trouble to develop those magnetized shoes. Now you get back into them and keep them zipped up. We'll have no unnecessary floating aboard this ship.
No, sir.
And of course, being a George Pal movie, the writers cannot resist the trope of having a comic relief crew member that needs everything explained to him, despite it being the most cringe-inducing aspect of Destination Moon. Indeed, Phil Foster is even more a clueless, clownish hick than Dick Weston, and hence even more unconvincing as the most knowledgeable in advanced electronics, and even more the most irritating character in a cast of irritating characters.
Sergeant Siegel?
Yes, sir.
I don't think there's a man on the wheel with less formal education than you possess.
Yes, sir. I'm sure ignorant, sir.
No one with a better knowledge of advanced electronics. I should like to have you along.
Souvenir! You two-timer tomato! But that's silly, I got a souvenir! Come on out, you red! I'll burn you!
But of course, even flat, nonsensical dialogue in a ridiculous melodrama can be rescued by great actors and thus create a great movie despite the screenplay.
He was the best star pilot in the galaxy and a cunning warrior. I understand you've become quite a good pilot yourself. And he was a good friend.
Sadly, The Conquest of Space does not have any great actors. So we're left with a poor script delivered by mediocre actors, which probably mostly accounts for the film's failure at the box office. But at least we should be okay on spacecraft accuracy. The book The Conquest of Space is about human expansion into the solar system, so surely at least they could get spacecraft designs from it. But here is the second of the book's problems. Most of Bonostel's images are showing the destinations, and in a way that's completely new, making the solar system a real place in the public consciousness. He even shows an Earthrise from lunar orbit, foreshadowing one of the most powerful images from the Apollo lunar landing program. But, and here's the kicker, it has very few depictions of spacecraft. This one showing a moon landing being the main one. And this image is very close to the imagery in Destination Moon. And George Powell would be looking for something that ups the game. So, in the end, the only usable thing the film could get from having the rights to the book The Conquest of Space was the title. So where to get the bucket load of spacecraft designs that the film would need? Well, this is where the association with Von Braun came to the rescue. Von Braun had been working up spacecraft and space station designs for reaching Earth orbit, and then the Moon, and finally, and especially, Mars, which he outlined in a book called Das Mars Project. Although this book does not describe the spacecraft in any detail, however, its illustrations do provide the basis for the background diagrams explaining the mission. Although not in his book, Von Braun did have worked out detailed designs. And it was these concepts that Bonostel had visualised in the iconic images used in the Collier magazine articles that were published between 1952 and 1954. Indeed, one of these paintings ended up with the British Interplanetary Society and is now proudly on display in the reception area. Now, the film does make the most of this gift. Although the blue screen effects could have been better, and while you would not expect them to pass muster to modern eyes, even at the time they were not special enough to wow audiences. Just as with Destination Moon, Conquest of Space is a manifesto for spaceflight. Although Conquest of Space could thus be seen as the spiritual sequel to Destination Moon, and in some ways that is true, but I would argue overall this is misleading as they were set in very different universes. Destination Moon was from the world of science fiction author Robert Heinlein using nuclear rockets. Conquest of Space reflected the vision of the German space engineering community that had moved to America before and after the Second World War. And it's not surprising that the rationale for undertaking spaceflight is different. In Destination Moon, the argument was for military power, with the moon being used as a missile base. So what does Conquest of Space offer up?
Man's very survival on Earth depends upon the success of this or some future search for a new source of raw materials.
This rationale is filled out with a 90-second speech from the Japanese crew member. And fair warning here, even by the low standards of this film, this is particularly cringeworthy.
Some years ago, my country chose to fight a terrible war. It was bad. I do not defend it. But there were reasons. Somehow those reasons are never spoken of. To the Western world at that time, Japan was a fairy book nation. Little people living in a strange land of rice paper houses. People who had almost no furniture. Who sat on the floor and ate with chopsticks. The quaint houses of rice paper, sir. They were made of paper because there was no other material available. And the winters in Japan are as cold as they are in Boston. And the chopsticks? There was no metal for forks and knives and spoons, where slivers of wood could suffice. So it was with the little people of Japan, little as I am now. Because for countless generations, we have not been able to produce the food to make us bigger. Japan's yesterday will be the world's tomorrow.
What's wrong with chopsticks? A perfectly reasonable way to eat one's daily rice. And when medieval Europeans, who at that time still used their hands on a general purpose knife, visited the Far East, they were impressed at how civilized and hygienic chopsticks were. This misrepresentation of the Japanese should perhaps be seen in the light of America's world-renowned knowledge and understanding of other peoples and their cultures. But the real problem with using such silly and just plain wrong arguments is that they trivialise and undermine the credibility of the underlying thinking. So when faced with these nonsense arguments, and given that the nonsense that was spouted in Destination Moon about the military importance of space, I am sure most people would question the validity of this Mark II rationale. Now, I'm guessing that the source of these two arguments in these movies is down to the technical advisors. And Von Braun would have been aware of the limits to growth argument because it was made in several popular books on spaceflight in the 1950s. Although I am not aware of him making it himself, at least in a public arena. But it is not a new thought. In fact, it goes all the way back to the Russian space pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1911. This famous quote is a slight mistranslation, but there is a discussion in The Exploration of Outer Space, and in it he outlines the basics of this rationale very clearly. So by the 1950s, the expansion of humanity into space as a way of overcoming limits to growth was a background belief for many astronautical thinkers, even though at the time the arguments were rather hand-waving in nature. Now, I'm sure these good people would have applauded the prospect of having this belief outlined in a Hollywood main feature. But whether they would have been as happy when they see the clumsy, error-ridden way in which it was actually presented, that I doubt. Certainly, as one of those who contributed in subsequent decades to refining the arguments and expanding the understanding of what would be required in terms of space capability, I would have my fingers crossed that anybody who I was trying to convince had not been previously contaminated by exposure to this nonsense. Now, the movie also gives an outing to one of the counter-arguments to spaceflight.
According to the Bible, man was created on the earth. Nothing is ever mentioned of his going to other planets. Not one blessed word.
At the time the Bible was written, it wouldn't have made much sense, would it?
Does it now? The biblical limitations of man's wanderings are set down as being the four corners of the earth. Not Mars or Jupiter or infinity. The question is, Bonnie, what are we? Explorers or invaders?
This sort of argument was more prevalent then than now. Indeed, it was the centre of a pub debate between Arthur C. Clarke and C.S. Lewis in 1954. And given the intellectual quality and proven eloquence of the participants, both sides of the debate were no doubt done justice. However, being the cruel joker that history is, we do not know what was actually said at this debate, largely on account of 3 of the 4 participants being world-class drinkers who could probably have qualified for the national team. Whereas Joker history has recorded this parody of the anti-argument for posterity, placed in the mouth of a character who is suffering from space madness. It's hardly a fair hearing. But what about the more general depiction of spaceflight in the film? As I've already said, the spacecraft and the space station come from Von Braun, and so, of course, as you might expect, there's no problems there. They're as good as you could have expected at the time and represent proper engineering. So, have we escaped fairy space altogether? Oh, no, no, no. We have the meteoroids in hunting packs trope, and as I have pointed out in previous videos, this is not possible. And even if it were, it would not affect a spinning space station like shown here. Although credit where it is due, this is a way to patch hull breaches. There is no way that asteroids glow like this. They would be a lot easier to find if they did. And once again, they cannot be accompanied by a hunting pack of meteoroids. And we still have ridiculous life-threatening accelerations combined with controls that need to be operated while accelerating being placed out of reach. This film adds another brick in the construction of fairy space, and that is the depiction of stars. We open with moving stars swimming past while speeding through the cosmos. Okay, let's be clear here. There is no place or speed in this universe where stars can move past you like this. Now, this gross misrepresentation could be argued as just a piece of artifice for the title sequence. But it later spread as a representation of spaceflight in other films, ending up in Star Trek. Now, we will look at fairy space stars in more detail in later videos, but there is a similar but more subtle error I would like to point out in this one. Note how the stars are sliding by like hedgerows on a road. This is just wrong. The fixed stars are, well, fixed and do not move under any circumstances. That is, assuming you can see them at all, and normally you can't. And there's also some premium grade absurdity in the dialogue, of which this is probably the high spot.
Take these wings, for instance. What in blazes are wings doing on this ship? There's no atmosphere on the moon.
The moon?
And this booster, all that power. What are we going to do, go up to the moon or going through it?
Never mind the propulsion, life support, communications, thermal control and power system, all of which would be vastly different to the point when any mentally challenged muppet, let alone competent engineer, building it would be able to determine what the ship was for. But it has our genius commander stumped, even though he knows the project's ultimate objective is Mars. By the way, if your rationale is to get resources to ensure humanity can escape limits to growth, it is the moon that is important. Mars is essentially useless. Somebody has not done their homework here. It's becoming a feature of these film videos that when I take issue with a movie's accuracy, I get swamped with comments saying, so what? It's only intended as a piece of entertainment. Well, firstly, while that is often true, I think in the case of this movie and Destination Moon for that matter, George Pal is genuinely trying to inform and inspire. But regardless of the maker's intent, even the most frivolous films influence the audience's perception. And where they cannot recalibrate against reality, this fantasy becomes the culturally accepted reality. Let us take a non-space example. The film Braveheart, made by the chronically Anglophobic Mel Gibson. The film purports to be a biopic of William Wallace, a real person and an important figure in Scottish English history. But this travesty is a strong contender for the most inaccurate historical film of all time. And don't get me started on kilt-wearing, road-painted Scottish soldiers. I do have an old VHS tape, but I've not been minded to upgrade it to a DVD. Plan 9 from Outer Space? Yes. Cowboys and Zombies? Yes. Highlander 2? Yes. But I do have standards. And if you're looking for historical accuracy, maybe I could recommend Carry On Cleo, which at least has historical characters who actually met each other. Yet this cowpat of a movie gives our culture its mental image of William Wallace, and even though I fully understand the complete inaccuracy, I still have to first expunge its influence from my mind whenever considering this part of history. Now, you could argue that this is just a piece of entertainment and it does not need to be historically accurate. Well, even if that is the case and it's not a piece of racist propaganda, this is not material. The power of the cinematic medium means it still influences our perceptions. Does this matter? Well, the politics of the interaction between England and Scotland is complex and still relevant. So yes, gross misrepresentations of the reality of the history that the audience cannot correct with their common experience is a matter of concern. And it is the same for space films. Whether they have an education component or are just escapist entertainment, they leave an impression as to what spaceflight is like and what can be done with it. And the audience, without the ability to recalibrate this impression against reality, is left with that as their impression of reality. Does that matter? Well, if the environmental health of planet Earth, the survival of our civilization, and even the lives of a large proportion of humanity is at stake, I'm thinking yes. It is a shame that the film that has the best fictional spaceships ever is such a mess in every other respect, leaving the audience with nothing of value. Even though The Conquest of Space was a deserved box office flop, these misrepresentations of spaceflight and the philosophical discussions around it would still have been seen by millions, whereas the popular books would have been read by thousands. And I can tell you from experience that academic papers that are the foundation of the subject are read by hundreds, even if they are influential. However, the main measurable influence of the movie was negative, as summed up by John Boson, who described the film as one of the most embarrassing science fiction films ever made. And as a result, it killed off the serious space genre until Kubrick's 2001.